All right, so last class period, we introduced the idea of cost structure of firms. So remember, that's what we're talking about here. What does a firm's cost structure look like? And we introduced the idea of short run and long run. We're not going to review that, but make sure you're clear on that your decisions that you're going to make are going to be different in the short run versus the long run. Remember, in the short run, not everything is variable. I gave you the example of a grocery store. In the short run, can't knock out its walls, expand. It probably can't completely change technology in the short run. So if I need to produce more in the short run, what might be the easiest way for me to meet an increase in sales? What should I do? In the short run, guys, when I can't change my factory, when I can't change my capital, my large scale capital investments, what can I do? Yeah, things like stay open longer, hire more workers, right? So in the short run, we talked about using more labor. Might be a typical approach to meeting an increase in demand. But in the long run, if I think that increase in demand is going to be permanent, then what did we say? The kinds of things we saw, the grocery store example I gave you, they did what? New technology, right? They were using those little stickers. They started using the scanning of the UPC, but that requires all new types of technology at every single register, right? That requires them to control databases and change prices in databases. So they have to have a whole new system. So as we talked about, the decisions that you make are going to differ in the short run and in the long run if you're a firm, because you don't have as much flexibility in the short run. Remember, in the short run, something is always fixed, right? Is anything fixed in the long run? Is there any variable that's fixed in the long run? What's the answer? No. Everything is variable in the long run. All right. So we then moved on, and let's quickly review the idea of variable costs and fixed costs. So we introduced the idea that we're going to be talking about total cost, which we're going to use TC as our abbreviation. And we said that total cost can be dismantled into variable costs, which we're going to call VC, and fixed costs, FC. Variable cost and fixed cost. And again, we've already covered this, but let's very quickly look at it again. Remember, variable costs vary with output. So they vary with Q. In other words, we said if Q goes up, I need more of my variable cost to produce. So our variable costs go up. If quantity goes down, then our variable costs go down. So who remembers some examples of variable cost? What would be examples? If I'm producing desks, what are my variable costs? Okay, raw materials. So does everyone agree that if I make more desks, I need more wood, I need more varnish, I need more nails? And then we also talked about hourly labor. So for each desk, I need somebody to work 2 hours. If I have more desks, I'm going to hire more people to work a few more hours. So let's think about that as a variable cost as well. When we talk about fixed cost, however, we're talking about costs that, do not vary with output. So fixed costs do not vary with output. So remember what we said. If our output goes up, what happens to fixed costs? What happens to fixed costs, everyone? They don't change. They're constant. But if our output goes down, then what happens? Again, fixed costs don't change. They are constant. All right. So some examples that we talked about with respect to our fixed cost might be our rent and the insurance policy that we're going to have. Does everyone agree? My rent is not contingent on how many units I produced, right? Nobody calls me and says, what's your output this month? I need to calculate your rent, right? One very important thing, though, that we're going to need to remember about variable cost and fixed costs. If our output is 0, if I'm making no desks, which means I have no costs for raw materials and I have no hourly labor of people I've hired to make the desks, then what happens to my variable cost? It's going to be 0, right? So this is an important point that we're going to be using today. We're going to need to remember that if we're not producing anything, we don't have any variable costs. But if my output is 0, for whatever reason, I have my factory and we are not going to produce this week, do my fixed costs go away? Does my landlord say, oh, you don't have to pay rent? Does my insurance go away? No. So what happens to my fixed cost? They stay, right? So if my output's 0, my fixed costs remain. They don't go away. So that's a very important point. When we're not producing, variable costs go away, right? But fixed costs do not. Everybody with me? Variable costs go away, but our fixed costs do not. All right? Now, last question I asked you. Can fixed cost change? Can fixed costs change? Well, fixed. They're called fixed costs. Does that mean they are locked in, cannot change? No. So they can change. So we want to remember they can change. My rent can go up. My insurance can go up. All right. So we need to remember fixed costs and variable costs. All right. Okay. Everybody with me? Variable cost and fixed costs. I know some of you have seen that in your accounting classes. So this is one place where economics and accounting overlap. And you're going to see some of the same content. All right. So now let's move on to talk about our cost curves and our cost curve calculations. We've already introduced the first cost equation. And we're going to need to be able to work with these cost equations. And they're not hard. It's math, but it's pretty simple math, so we want to keep it easy. Let's not get overwhelmed by this because this is nothing difficult. So the first cost equation we already know. Our first cost equation is simply that total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost, right? And we left off with this last class period, right? So far we haven't covered anything new. So all of this is review. So cost equation number 1 is super easy. My total costs for my operation are the sum of my fixed cost and my variable costs. Anything there that's going to be difficult for you to remember? Absolutely not. So that's super easy. All right, let's talk about our second cost equation. Our second cost equation is going to be about marginal cost. And we're going to abbreviate that like we have before, MC, marginal cost, MC. But it's important for you to remember when we used marginal cost before, when we did marginal analysis before, we were simply talking about the marginal cost to me of getting another slice of pizza. I walk in, do I want one slice? Yes, no. Do I want another slice? I kept weighing my marginal benefits and my marginal cost. What we're talking about here, because we're talking about firm theory, we're talking about the marginal cost of production. So what does it take the firm to produce another unit? So when we talk about marginal cost of production, we're asking how much will it cost? Oops, sorry. how much will it cost for the firm to produce an additional unit? How much will it cost for the firm to produce an additional unit? So maybe we've already made 10 desks. And if we've already made 10 desks, then what we're asking is, what is the increase in cost to go up to 11 desks? So I've made 10. And now somebody wants one more. What's it going to cost me to go from 10 desks to 11 desks? So this is very simple. Marginal cost here is going to simply be the change in total cost given a change in Q. So let's take a look at this for a second. Change in total costs over change in Q. Now guys, for some of you, the math is a little confusing because the notation throws you off. Keep it simple. What does delta mean again? Change in, right? So put this into a sentence. This says, what is the change in total cost when quantity changes, right? What's the change in total cost? What is the change in total cost when quantity changes? All right. But we need to simplify this a little bit. What can I plug in right here for total cost? What can I plug in for total cost? Do I have an equation for total cost somewhere? Okay, so what can I plug in for total cost? Fixed cost plus variable cost, right? Equation number 1, right? Good, thank you. Everyone agree that I've got an equation for total cost and I can plug that in. So let's do that. So this is going to be the change in fixed cost plus variable cost over change in Q. All right. Now, I'm going to distribute through the change in sign. So change in fixed cost plus change in variable cost over change in Q. So far, so good. Everybody with me? Nothing difficult here. And I'm going to simplify it even further. So let's write this as change in fixed cost over change in Q plus change in variable cost over change in Q. So everyone agree? That's legit. I haven't violated any math rules. So now I've got two terms. Change in fixed cost over change in quantity, change in variable cost over change in quantity. So what this is saying, take a look. Marginal cost is equal to the amount that my fixed cost changes when I change Q and the amount that my variable cost changes when I change Q. Okay, nothing hard there. But what do we know about this term right there? What do we know about that first term? How does my fixed cost change when Q changes? So I'm building another desk. How do my fixed costs change? My fixed costs are constant. So do they change? No, fixed costs don't change with output. Everyone agree with that? So what can I do with this term? I know it's going to be 0, right? I know it's going to be 0 because fixed costs don't change with output. So I know that first term is going to drop out. So does everyone see what I did? I substituted equation 1. And then I was able to get rid of one of my terms because fixed costs don't change, right? When I build that extra desk, does my rent change? No. Does my insurance change? No. So that leaves me with marginal cost equals change in variable cost over change in Q. So there's 2 ways to calculate marginal cost. Both of them will work. Both of them will work. 2 different ways to calculate marginal cost. But what we've just generated, marginal cost is change in variable cost over change in Q. It's important to understand what we can conclude from that. What that tells us is that marginal cost is comprised of what type of cost? When I calculate my marginal cost, it is comprised of only what type of cost? Variable cost. Think about why that is. Think about why we know that variable cost is comprised only of variable cost. Marginal cost is comprised only of variable cost. So let's think about it. You want a desk. You place an order for a desk. What do I need to do to make that desk? What do I need to get? Raw materials. I need to get some labor, right, to make that. Raw materials and labor. So any fixed costs there? Raw materials and labor. So I need raw materials and labor. And none of those are fixed costs. Everyone with me? Does that make sense? So I see some of you not writing anything down, guys. That seems like bad advice. You should be writing lots of stuff down because I'm going to expect you to understand this intuition, okay? All right, so now we have cost curve equation 1 and cost curve equation 2. Super easy. Okay, nothing hard. Do you agree with me? Nothing hard yet. All right, let's move on to number 3. Number 3, number 4, and number 5 all go together. 3, 4, and 5 all go together. 3, 4, and 5 are going to give me my average cost curves. All right, so 3, 4, and 5, very similar. So number 3 is going to be average fixed cost. And we're going to abbreviate that AFC. Average fixed cost is basically asking, on average, how much fixed cost goes into each unit. On average, how much fixed cost goes into each unit? So I've got rent, I've got insurance, and I want to figure out on average how much goes into each unit. So how would I calculate this, guys? How would I calculate this? I need to start with my fixed cost, right? And do what? Divide by what? Do we agree? Guys, this has to be intuitive. If you have no idea, then you do not really understand the intuition of what we're trying to do here, okay? So I've got rent and I've got insurance. And I've produced 100 units. And I want to know on average how much of my fixed cost goes into each unit. So how do I calculate that? Divide it by 100 units, right? So I take my fixed cost and I divide it by Q. So average fixed cost is going to be, so there's equation 3, simply take my fixed cost and divide it by Q. I want to do the same thing to calculate average total cost, ATC. So with average total cost, we're asking, oops, I should say on, sorry about that, on average, how much total cost goes into each unit? On average, how much total cost goes into each unit? So I've calculated my total costs, and I have 100 units. So how do I calculate this, guys? I take my total cost and divide by what? By those 100 units I produced, right? Good. So I take my total cost and divide through by that 100 units I've produced, or whatever number of units I've produced. So average total cost. So now I've got equation 4. And then finally, I've got average fixed cost. I'm sorry, average variable cost, AVC. And average variable cost is exactly the same idea. We're saying on average, how much variable cost goes into each unit. So average variable cost, how are we going to compute this? We're going to start with what? Variable cost and divide it by Q. Equation 5. So do you see what I mean when I say equations 3, 4, and 5 go together? They're all average costs. They're all average costs. All right. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Everyone agree these are easy cost equations, right? They're easy, nothing difficult here. Okay. All right. Equation 6. We're going to start with equation 1. So equation 1 is what? Oh, total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost. So total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost. We're going to start with equation 1. Then we're going to divide the whole thing by Q. So we're going to start with equation 1 and then divide by Q. So I'm going to start with equation 1 and then I'm going to divide by Q. What can I replace this first term with? TC divided by Q. What can I replace that with? Yeah, everyone agree? ATC, right? We just covered that. What equation is that? Average total cost, number 5, right? So that was that equation 5. And what can we replace fixed cost divided by Q with? AFC, good. And that was equation what? 3. And what can I replace BC divided by Q? Average variable cost. Equation, what? Is that right? 4?
Yes, it's 5.
All right, y'all are giving me the wrong numbers here. So what equation is ATC, guys? I need you to look back for me. What equation is AFC? 3. What equation is ABC? 5. All right. Super easy, am I right? So now I've got an equation that says average total cost equals what? Average fixed cost good plus average variable cost. Okay? Everybody with me? Easy. So this is equation number 6. So we have 6 cost curve equations, and all of them are pretty straightforward. All right? But now we need to use them. Now we need to use them. All right? So we're going to create a chart for ourselves. And we're going to need to add on to this. So we're going to start. Let's do some cost calculations. So I'm going to call this a cost calculation chart. And you're going to need to be able to do this. And you're going to be doing this for homework. And I'm going to have to give you Q and total cost. I'm going to have to give you that much. So let's say that we have quantities 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And when output is 0, our total cost is 1,000. When Q is 1, our total cost is 1,400. When Q is 2, our total cost is 1,675. 3, it's 1,900. 4, it's 2,100. 5, 2,350. And 6, 2,650. All right. So I'm going to have to give this to you. But I contend that once I've given that to you guys, you can calculate all other pieces of cost information. So from this, we need to be able to find fixed costs, variable costs, marginal cost, average total cost, average variable cost, and average fixed cost. So we can find every one of those things. And all I have to do is give you Q and total cost. All right? So we need to make sure that we can get through this. Now, let me give you a hint on how to get started on this. The easiest place for us to start would be right here, filling in that cell right there. So take a look back at your notes. What do we know about variable cost when we're not producing anything, right? Because at this point, output is 0. Everybody, what do we know? If I'm producing no desks, not making any desks at all, do I have any variable costs? No. So I know this is 0, right? Everyone agree? So I'm going to put a little note that I think that's the best starting place. Now, once I know variable cost is 0, I can fill in this cell. So this is your second point. So what can I conclude, guys, about my fixed cost? It's what? It's 1,000. Do we agree with that? How do I know? Equation 1, right? So all I have to do is look at equation 1, which tells me that total cost is fixed cost plus variable cost, right? But my variable costs are 0. Everybody with me? Does that make sense? So is it obvious to everyone why our fixed cost is 1,000? Is that obvious to everyone? Because I know my variable costs are nothing. Now, the next thing I can do is fill in that whole column of fixed cost. If I know that fixed costs are 1,000 when I'm not producing anything, what are my fixed costs when I'm producing one desk? Are they also 1,000? Yeah, because they don't change, right? My rent doesn't change. My insurance isn't changing when I produce my first desk. What about when I produce 2 desks? Same, right? 1,000. You with me? Does that make sense? So what can I write down that whole column? Yeah, 1,000. Let's do it. All right. So that's easy, right? But do you see how I have to remember my starting point? I have to remember that when I'm not producing anything, right? I have to remember when I'm not producing anything, variable costs are 0. Or else I don't know where to start, right? I don't have a place to jump in and get this going. All right, so can we now calculate variable costs? Can we now calculate variable costs, everybody? All right, do it. And I want to see everybody working. Guys, everyone's pen should be moving. You don't need a calculator to do this math. This is very easy math. So if you didn't bring a calculator, you should still be working. All right, so this should be easy. Kennedy, what is my variable cost when output's 1? 400. Good. Let me change colors. 400. And what about when output is 2, Courtney? 675. Is everyone getting these right? And what about when output is 3, Brandon? 900. Good. Everyone understand where Brandon got 900 from? And Rebecca, what about when output's 4? 1100. And what about when output is 5, Taylor? 1350. Good. And Katie, what about when output is 6? 1650. All right, everyone getting that right? Super easy, right? All I'm doing is taking total cost and subtracting off 1,000. So that's easy. Equation 1, right? All I need is equation 1. Okay. Now, we need to move on to talk about marginal costs. So let me change colors here. Now, let's remind ourselves. Marginal cost is the change in, I can do it 2 ways, right? Total cost, change in total cost over change in Q. Or, what's the other way I can do it? Marginal cost is what? Change in what? Variable cost, good, over change in Q. Are they going to give me the same answer? Yeah, they have to. They have to give me the same answer, right? So here's a question for you from what we did with marginal analysis. What do I know about marginal cost when Q is 0? When Q is 0, when there is no change in Q, what do we know? Is it 0? Not 0. You're shaking your head. What is it? Mathematically undefined. Guys, you have to remember this stuff. We need to understand that marginal cost is only defined. Look at the equation. It's only defined when Q is changing. So if I haven't produced anything, is there a marginal cost? That would make no sense. The marginal cost of the 0th desk, does that make any sense? No. That's like saying the 0th piece of pie, right? Well, it's just not mathematically defined because marginal cost is the change in cost. When I change the number of desks I'm making. Everyone remember this now from our intro? Good. All right, so let's use total cost. Everyone agree I need to go from, oops, sorry, that is not what I'm doing. My bad. We want to go from 0 to 1, right? That's my first margin, 0 to 1. And do we agree that total cost changes by what? By $400. So does everyone agree when we went from 0 desks to 1 desk, our total cost went from 1,000 to 1,400? So my marginal cost is what, everybody? $400. Everyone agree? $400. Now, we need to go from 1 to 2. How many desks have I added? When I go from 1 to 2, how many desks have I added? 1, right? So the denominator of this calculation is 1, right? So I've added 1 more desk. Total cost goes up by how much? 275. 275 divided by 1 is 275, right? Everyone agree? Marginal cost of the second desk is 275. All right, take a minute and calculate the rest of the marginal cost yourself. All right, so Jacob, what's marginal cost of the third unit? 225. Good. And what about marginal cost of the fourth unit, Ryan? 200. Do we agree with these answers, guys? Everyone agree? Everyone getting the right answers? Good. What about the fifth unit, Olivia? 250. Good. All right. And Abiel, what about the sixth unit? 300. All right. Do we like those answers? Everyone getting those right? Make a note to yourself in your notes that the marginal cost of the first unit is not 0. Make a note that marginal cost is only defined when Q is changing. So if we're just sitting at 0, Q is not changing, right? So marginal cost, the concept doesn't exist, okay? Be clear on that. All right. Now let's look at average total cost. Remind me, what's the equation? Average total cost equals what? Total cost divided by Q. Everyone agree? What do we know when Q is 0? When Q is 0, this would be what? 1,000 divided by 0, right? Everyone agree? What is 1,000 divided by 0?
0.
Is it 0? Is 1,000 divided by 0, 0? No. If I have a pie and I divide it amongst 0 people, they don't get 0 pieces of pie, right? That's nonsensical. So what is the answer? 1,000 total cost divided by 0 is what? It's not 0, it's what? Mathematically undefined, right? Mathematically undefined. So we need to note that average total cost is mathematically undefined. Let's remind ourselves, if we have 1,000 divided by 0, division by 0 is not 0. So 1,000 divided by 0 is not 0. Everybody with me? Does that make sense? Mathematically undefined. All right. So take a second and calculate your average total cost. Calculate average total cost. So everyone calculate average total cost. All right, check your answers against mine. Make sure I haven't made any calculation errors. Everyone getting the same answers? Any questions? Everyone getting this right? Okay, great. So now let's calculate average variable cost. What's the equation again for average variable cost? Yeah, variable cost divided by Q. So again, that's going to be 0 divided by 0 right here, right? When output is 0, variable cost is 0. So I have 0 divided by 0. If I have 0 pieces of pie and I divide them amongst 0 people, what's the answer to that? Is it 0? If 0 people share 0 pieces of pie, is that 0? Ah, mathematically undefined again, okay? 0 divided by 0 is not 0. So let's make a note of that. 0 divided by 0 is not 0, so it's mathematically undefined. But after 0, after we get to quantity equal 1, it's defined. So everyone take a moment, calculate your average variable cost. All right, so check your work. We getting the right answers, guys? Everyone getting the right answers? Anyone need help on any of this? All right, then the last thing we have to calculate is average fixed cost. And average fixed cost is fixed cost divided by Q, right? So we have 1,000 divided by 0 right here when output is 0. What did we say that's equal to? Mathematically undefined. Good. So everyone calculate your average fixed costs. And I always suggest keeping at least one decimal place. You're going to have a little bit of rounding error, but you do need some decimals. All right, we getting the right answers? We getting the right answers, everyone? So everyone agree this is super easy? So everyone's going to get 100% on this part of the test. Well, I would use normal rounding, but you're going to have, you know, a little bit of inaccuracy because you're going to have to round, keep at least one decimal point. Okay. All right, so guys, I'm going to show you that there are two places where you can check your work. You can check your work. The first is right here. Everyone agree that equation 1 needs to hold, right? Take a look at that. Equation 1 needs to hold. Does it? Does equation 1 hold? Go through and eyeball it. So you can use these first 3 columns and make sure that you've not made any errors because equation 1 has to hold. What can I use for the last 3 columns? What can I use for the last 3 columns, guys? Equation what? Equation 6. So equation 6 must hold, right? Does it? Yeah, there's a little bit of rounding error, but these are 2 ways that you can check your work. Everybody with me? You've got to make sure that you've not made any careless mistake. Now, for homework, you're going to have an assignment where you complete a table like that, but then you're going to be graphing, and I want to go through this very quickly so you are not confused. So for homework, you're going to complete a cost chart. And then from that cost chart, you're going to create a graph. On that graph, on one graph, so I want everything on one graph, you're going to graph marginal cost, average total cost, and average variable cost. So you're going to plot 3 things on one graph. You're going to put quantity on the horizontal axis, and you're going to put dollars on the vertical axis. But an important step. First, you're only plotting these 3 things. Do not give me anything else. Do not give me the wrong things, or else you won't have the assignment right. You need to look at the largest number that you're going to have to plot. Not the largest number on the table, but the largest number that you will have to plot. And if it's 75, for example, then you need to create the scale of your vertical axis accordingly. Does that make sense? So if the biggest number that you have to create, that you have to plot is 75, don't give me a scale that's on 0 to 500. Does that make sense? Because your graph will be very, very small. So This is not necessarily what your curves look like, but let's say one curve looks like this, the other looks like that, and the other looks like that. I'm just making up curves. You're going to label them marginal cost, average total cost, average variable cost. That's not what they're going to look like. But I'm just saying you're going to have a graph with things intersecting possibly like that. Does that make sense? Make sure it's fully labeled. All right. So again, don't worry if your graph looks different than mine. It should, but it's essentially all on one graph. Everybody with me? All right. Good luck.